Well, thank you all very much for your evocative, provocative interventions. And I was struck by the resonances between your different presentations, whether it was the focus on sound and audio, as in Candace's talk and Tedros' talk earlier, or whether or not, or whether it was the kind of the focus on activism and the kind of the relationships between artists and activist movements. And one of the things that, I was kind of like thinking about in preparing for this was really thinking about also the larger theme of the conference, which in some ways is asking a very provocative question about art's ability or power to intervene or to affect any kind of meaningful social engagement. And I think that many of you answered that, whether explicitly or implicitly. I think Moses and Candace very explicitly in terms of offering examples where there is a productive relationship between art and activism. Or implicitly, I think, seeing in your presentation, which kind of presents the way that art can offer cognitive challenges to the way that we think that with the binaries that structure the way that we think we know the world, and that maybe challenge those kind of ways of knowing. I was wondering if maybe you could say a little more about, or maybe a way of addressing more explicitly this kind of the central question that the conference organizers have asked us, and if you could say a little more, tease out a little more, how your presentations kind of address that question, and also if you have any, remarks or comments for each other, because it seems to me that there are these kind of ways in which they speak to each other, and now is the chance, I guess, for us to address those. So, does anyone want to take a stab at that, or?
Hello? It's on. Yeah. Thank you very much. One of the things that I've struggled with trying to both do and present this research over the last maybe 3 years has been to really ask about the question of not only of politics, but also personal relationships. And I think one of the very devastating sort of things which sort of happened was to realize how disconnected politics can be from people living in a place, and really to think about the sort of interrelationships that people have in their homes, with each other, in schools, in families. And so when I think about the question of the conference, I think that social, I think it's not just a question about social practice, it's also a question about the lives that people are living and the way these lives are sort of interconnected within a highly networked, politicized space. How do we necessarily, I don't want to be Darwinian, but how do we survive the onslaught of sort of depoliticization and repoliticization that we go through. How do we survive the sort of like both memory and trauma of colonialism and recolonization and decolonization, which are all kind of necessarily violent phenomena and violent waves of thinking and doing. So yeah, that's my...
I have a response to your question. I was thinking a lot about it because, you know, when there were all these threats circulating against Rebecca's work, it wasn't the only one. A Greek artist who, I wanted to speak about her work, but I think I need more time, Mary Zaguri, had been working in a neighborhood near the port in Athens. She's from Athens, but this wasn't her neighborhood for about a year with high school students. And the reason that she chose that neighborhood was because it was the site of quite horrific mass killing by Nazis of so-called Greek communists in the 1940s. And she was interested in not only this moment, of which there is a monument, so the place where they were lined up and killed, the building remains as a monument, but there's also a museum. There was an artist, Greek artist working in the 1970s, a performance artist, who had also done work around this, so it was a way to revive her performances and her archives as well. A few hours before her first public performance, the entire neighborhood was graffitied with swastikas. And at first we thought, which was maybe like a knee-jerk reaction, that it was done by members of the Golden Dawn. So Golden Dawn are a fascist party in Greece who have actually seats within parliament. And so an understanding of parliament and true democracy is that everyone has a voice, even in this case in Greek society, also fascist. But it wasn't them, actually. It was high school students. So that was a surprise for her, and that's something that she is working through. And so what I was thinking is, you know, the question might be not how can art respond to these instances, but in fact how art exposes that they're even there, that these feelings are even there and these sentiments are there.
Which is kind of interesting that, you know, the kind of, it reveals something, right? The art has that ability to kind of reveal these kind of divisions or these kinds of contradictions. But then at the same time, I think one of the things, this is what you were saying about relationships, was kind of, that was something else that I noted in several of your talks, was that you were situating, and Candace, I think, you know, the portions of your talks, especially about Baudic, made this very clear, where art is not necessarily something that is situated in a gallery, it is not necessarily situated in an exhibition space, but something that can be situated in a community and that has a life, circulates within that community. And that's something I think that was a point that you made in your talk, I think, when you were talking about religion and the spaces of worship, right, and religion, were these things that could be thought of in an art context, but, you know, don't necessarily have to be thought of in that context, you know, have a different life, right? Or when, Zhezhe, when you were talking about, I think you made the statement about the practitioners can change each other, right? The process of collaboration between practitioners, and so in some ways it shifts the focus away from the end product, as it were, towards the kind of the practice and the process, right? And that's something that I think several of you are talking about, and in some ways it's kind of moving away from this kind of grand question of how can art affect society into how can art kind of serve as a connective tissue for different forms of community, maybe, you know. And that was really interesting as well. I don't know if that's really necessarily a question, but just kind of a comment, I guess. Yeah.
guess my point was very simple. If temple is the art center, what do you art people do with it? Rather than say it can be, I'm saying it is. So I don't think I'm understood properly, okay? So if you turn around, that's why the rest are the 蚊子馆, right? Mosquito. And I think it has everything to do with this thing called decolonization, especially in the third world context. But what does decolonization mean? I've been working on the subject for since early 1990, if not earlier, right? And I'm happy to see more and more people start addressing that. But especially, I made a point, some of you were not there yesterday, right? I mean, for instance, this is real politics. I mean, French government still collecting colonial tax from 13 African countries. What is the legitimacy of all these? Foucault and so on, right? Derrida. I mean, Angola questions a different thing. But people worshiping French theory. That's self-colonization in a lot of ways, right? I mean, so what does it mean? I use another term, de-imperialization. That's the project. Should be done in the imperial center. And a lot of us are living in the so-called ex-colonized world. And these two sides, this is very Fanonian, right? Need to work together. But it's not being done at Taiwan, the Japanese. I think it's actually not an easy project. What is the methodology, right? When we sit together, I've been going in and out of Japan. And what is the methodology for decolonization on the intellectual level, on interaction level, right? You work in New York, and you work in, I mean, Kampala, I mean, this is the Commonwealth, Hong Kong, and so on. But in those larger contexts, you talk about art world. And I also suggested art did not exist for us. It's self-colonizing to keep using the notion of art to reproduce that notion. I give you the example, calligraphy was the intellectual practice, community life, then become art. Confucius become religion. So categorically, it need to be problematized. So that's why I've been saying this to my, including AAA colleagues and so on. All these need to be reconceptualized. Not only that, I think art institution can be transformed. Right? Rather than, we put this thing called archiving and, I mean, temple, you can work with temple, and temple master can give lecture in this, and they can do exhibition. Invite them in to do whatever they want to do. That's what has been done, right? But market and so on. So the space level is only one. But how do we, I think eventually you boil it down, especially for the art worker, it is the mode of thought. If we don't return, constantly self-regenerating, it's locked within a closed space. You see street people. Hong Kong have many, many street people. None of them here. We, in Taiwan, a lot of people come in to eat with the cookies and so on. But they also participate asking questions. And in certain places, these people will be kicked out. Is this the public space? Right? And so on.
This is something slightly different. I was noticing one element that was common to many of the presentations today. That was, and this echoes Quan Xing's concern about dismantling existing categories. And here it's a much more obvious category than even art, or not so abstract, which is the nation state, which I've been quite preoccupied with because I'm trying to teach undergraduates in Hong Kong who don't have a nation, what is a nation state. So this has been really hard for me to think about. and work through when I look at my own material, when I look at my own past experience in the Caribbean, where again the question of the nation is being problematized in a very different way. And then I come into the space of the metropolitan colonial city like Bombay, and of course now Hong Kong, where again the nation almost doesn't matter because the port city is a universe in unto itself. And I found that in very different ways, whether you're talking about the Chinese artists in Africa or the African in China, or what the First Peoples are doing in Canada, or what you're talking about Pan-Africanism, Quan Ching talking about Chinese peoples everywhere, or whatever. I felt there was a common element in some very implicit questioning of the main category that organizes a lot of our thinking and organizes and regulates our everyday life. So I just found that was interesting. I didn't expect that we would have that in common.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly comment on the fact that we're all speaking in English here, and the language we speak and the specific vocabulary we use instrumentalize the kind of conversation we can have. If we're talking in Chinese or Italian or Arabic, I'm sure we're having a very different conversation. And I've been thinking about that a lot because when I first started working in the art world, I served often as a translator, either simultaneously on stage or through writing. And it's just perpetual state of dissatisfaction of the things that are lost and then the power structures implied. And just based off what Chen Guangxing was saying, that sure, in a way, multilingual people who have been in the position traditionally defined as the other in relation to the West do know a great deal more in a way because we have to learn the languages in order to speak or even to express dissent, dissatisfaction to the discourse. But at the same time, I think that there are also different forms of misunderstanding that could be interesting rather than just unproductive. And I think those are the cracks that sometimes energize and excite me.
Can I say one word? I have to register my disagreement, right? By now, English is no longer theirs. Singlish. I mean, if you keep, we Chinese speak in two imperial language, Mandarin and English. But we position English as theirs, I think by now wrong. Indian, African, and so on have been using, I'll tell you, African English is much more advanced than English. All right? You go to French, the same. So I think Chinese has a really Sinocentric mindset, trying to suggest, English is not our. All my Korean friends speak Korean with a Korean accent, not to mention Singapore and Indian and so on, except Chinese. Okay? In Taiwan, we say English is not proper. We don't even know it's American English. Okay? We educate say. So in that sense, I don't think English can be understood that way anymore. We have to use English. My Chinese friend, why don't everyone speak Mandarin? You know what I mean? I don't have any excuse to speaking English because we need to, in different era. Those language somehow gets spoken because of imperialism and so all for other end, right? Out of convenience, because conversation never properly understood anyway. Not to mention translation, right? It's never coming through. So in that sense, I think we need to set all these things carefully, especially if you uphold two imperial languages. It become a political gesture, okay? Sorry, I'm older. I have to pass on the experience to my younger compatriot, if you wish. But one word about this Hong Kong thing. I'm working on this thing. I'm giving a talk in Baptist University on small countries. It's the worrying state. If you dismantle unlearn the nation state, there are other models. Hong Kong can be can be a country. Why not? Right? Warring state and so on. And by now, Central, Hong Kong Central can be a small country. You know what I mean? It depends on how you conceptualize. But we're bound up with a stupid thing called nation state. And so I'm working on, this is about, Tagore and Tan Yunshan, this build the Tagores together. They've been, there for 1 century. I'm going to India, part of it for the Sino-China conflict. If we reconceptualize, Calcutta is a thing on its own, right? And everywhere, the so-called little kingdom and so on, disappeared. I think it can be liberating. Medium, large size, larger country have to have a responsibility. In that sense, mainland China should have. Beijing is another country on its own. So I think a lot of things can be, once you get outside of the assumption, then you can imagine, and I think that's work for critical intellectual.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that? I think I, in principle, agree with what you were saying, but I was essentially suggesting linguistic differences and how that opens up different possibilities. And I'm definitely not speaking from a limiting point of view, but how other kinds of fun we might have if were to have this in a different language. But your comment does make me realize that I need to be more specific with my comment. And I'm from mainland China. Of course, I'm Sinocentric. There's no way that I'm free from that bias in a lot of ways. Even if I claim to be, there are unexamined and unself-aware ways that I would come across as Sinocentric. And the way English is taught and practiced in mainland China is different from these other regions you were listing. And we still have a very powerful and nimble language that is Chinese. And if you experience Chinese on the internet, it is often combined very freely, especially in these subcultures that I was commenting on with Korean, Japanese, English. I've even seen Arabic influences on the kind of internet-based Chinese language. So I think that plays a huge role in, I don't know, in general, how we think about cultural production that are filtering through people's mind all the time. It might not manifest steadily in the artworks or even critical thinking, but it's there.
Well, maybe say what you're going to say, and then we'll take questions. Yeah. Or do you?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of speak to your presentation on translation, necessarily, and I think Africa. I'm always corrected by Brazilians who tell me that when you say Africa, you're leaving us out. Afro-Brazilians, because of your thinking about Africa as a geographical continent. Just to sort of keep in mind the way you sort of phrased this idea of translating between various publics, to recognize that we constitute various publics even within the conceptual understandings and methodologies of decolonization and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's all.
Great. So maybe we'll take some questions from I think there was one question in the back. So 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
4. Okay. Go ahead.
My question is, I guess, triggered by what Professor Chen just said, but I guess it's somehow addressed to all of you. I agree that the significant operation now to do is this restructuring of knowledge, but I'm curious, how do you counter the possibility of this being performed as just another shift inside the elite? So just power being transferred from one elite to another, instead of it becoming a reformation of knowledge and of it addressing those who need to be empowered and who don't have power. So I mean, we've seen many times, revolutions or whatever being just changing one power for another. So I'm curious what tools specifically have you developed that would counter that?
Oh, yeah, so maybe all the questions? Okay. So then you can pick which one.
Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to comment as a translator, as a maker and organizer, on just kind of to problematize sure, English is a global language, French is a global language, Chinese is a global language, whichever, but the inherent art histories, the epistemologies that come out of Europe, that come out of the Enlightenment, detachment of Europeans from their own indigeneities, mean that when the 100% of the Samoan community that I belong to expresses our literature entirely in English, our art practices, our essays around what we are doing in terms of culture entirely in English, we are othering ourselves to ourselves. And our language isn't coming with us, we're not developing it. So it's like, I guess, there's reading Derrida in French. There's reading Derrida in Algerian French, because he is an Algerian first. There's a whole lot of context that is being missed when we're only accessing things in English translation, and we're being lazy and not learning each other's languages, seeing each other, listening to each other. Just wanted to kind of drop that. It's not really a question, but really kind of the translation role of writing our art histories that I definitely see in Candace's practice is something that I think I'm really more excited about how to write in my language so that my grandma understands what I'm doing, and centering indigenous audiences first, and then everyone else can come along later. Thanks.
Thank you for the talks. And I think I have one question raised to Professor Chen, which can also, I think, be answered by other participants, because it has something to do with the public function of art, and specifically art institutions. And I don't know if I read it correctly, but I think probably Professor Chen, your disappointment on the art institutions sort of comes out of this kind of like a failed project of the intervention into the public sphere of art. I mean, as an intellectual, you hope art to shoulder its social role, which is also the topic of our of our conference. But if you really look art's role in a society, it's not as what it claims. If you look at art institution, they are, or they at least claim themselves to be public, but it's still sort of elitist, especially in comparison with temples, where which actually attracted a large audience, but ignored by our cultural workers. So my question is based on my interpretation of your talk, and I have actually two parts of my question. One is regarding, well, the introduction of temple into art spaces, because I'm from the northern, actually the central part of China, Henan province, where it arguably is the birthplace of feudal system, or the sense of family clan, in a sense, where and later, a lot of like 客家人, or the migration from the central part of China, migrated to say today's Canton, Fujian, and of course Hong Kong and Taiwan, where they bring this sense of family clan to these areas. And as a people from the north, from the central part of China, I do feel that this sense of tradition, this sense of family clan is much stronger here than in the north. Probably there are a lot of historical reasons, like Cultural Revolution and everything. But a very specific question is, what if temple and religious rituals do not have like as large a influence in the north as it is here? Do we in the north bring these rituals into public institutions, or who should define what is public? This is the first part. And the second part is when you say you want to bring temple into art spaces, you say you just open the space up and let the rituals, the monks to do whatever they want. But I mean, as intellectuals, are you critical of some of the practice they do? Are you just hold a very relativist attitude? I mean, in terms of like you do whatever you want, because some people, well, I myself, as I'm quite critical of some practices. I mean, not saying them like feudal or superstitious, but something that's well, probably too offensive, but anti-human. I mean, not getting to the specifics, but just the probably the darker side of religion. Should we all like bring them into public sphere without any critical like investigation? So that's basically two parts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have a sort of general question to everyone. I think, like, where would you draw this line between decolonization and when it becomes to appear like more like a conservative practice, and maybe like this binary is really irrelevant. I mean, like I don't want to go into this binary, but to refer to Chen, for instance, like you were saying about foreigners, that we are all foreigners and then we have to return home. But then at the same time, left conservative, not left, I'm sorry, ultra-right European conservatives are kind of using similar rhetorics regarding refugees that are coming to Europe, like saying that we are losing like our own tradition and we are foreigners in our own country. So basically it's used as a tool for exclusion. Yeah, and in this sense, probably because I'm coming like from the context of post-Soviet countries, from Ukraine, and then there is like a certain discussion there, like whether Soviet Union can be really rendered as like the process of colonization, like was the Soviet Union just the process of colonization, or is it has a certain peculiar for this region dynamics, and it's not like really a colonization or something different? But yeah, but then the point is maybe this foreigners like category is not something which is negative, which maybe it's something which can give us opportunities to resist. I don't know, to like this kind of conservative traditional like turn, or yeah. So if you, I was clear enough, or should I?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we had 4 comments and questions, and does anyone want to start or? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm directly addressing these questions because I don't think they really came out of my presentation, but I just feel compelled to jump into the discussion and just comment on 2 aspects of the discussion. The one more generally the language thing, because I've spent most of my life as an adult working with languages and working on languages. So I felt impelled to jump in on this. Also because my the current work, which is on music, is proposing the idea of what I call the lingua musica, which allows people coming from very different backgrounds, coming into a city space where they don't have a common language, to use the common language they derive from being part of the musical public, to such an extent that it becomes part of the cultural vernacular in that city. So that's, for me, been a very illuminating process to try and understand how that happens. So Hindustani, which is not the language of people anywhere around Bombay, which may be the language of a small number of migrants who come into Bombay, becomes the cultural vernacular of the city, and it is to this day, 150 years later. It becomes the vernacular of the Hindi cinema, which is considered the national cinema of India. So I think it's a really complex process, how languages come together, there's a churning, something comes up, which doesn't really belong to anyone, but belongs to everyone. So I think that that's important to hold on to as an insight. That is not about some hegemonic language replacing everything else, but something that we collectively produce, that is convenient, that we use, And when it stops being useful, I think we move on and find something else. I think maybe that's sort of the point that Guanxing was making. And I'm sure that we are not in disagreement about this particular point. Going from there, I would say that to my mind, there's really no going back. I think that we're committed to a particular way of living in our modernity and acknowledging its complexities and difficulties, and not saying that we will hark back to some earlier resource and bring it back in the way that it is. I think it's answering in some ways addressing the question of the friend from Henan province, right? So we do try to seek cultural resources from the past, but to my mind, I don't know what Guanxing thinks, but I would say that you cannot simply pick up something, either a practice or an artifact or a process or an institution, and plant it in the present. It's not going to work. So how do we create cultural resources by thinking about the past? I've tried to examine that through the music, right? You're remaking the past. It cannot be the past.
Yeah.
And in that process, you are going to drop many aspects of it. And it's not as though it's lying there waiting to be remade. It's that by positioning your memories in the present, you're changing the present and you're changing the past as well. And this is not a simple process either to understand or to explain. I'm just saying that we need to be alert to it. And through musical practice, I've found a way of engaging with this question.
Yeah, I just want to probably continue from where you start, but also address this question about conservatism that came up, whether, thinking through terms like decolonization makes us conservative or elitist. I'll start from the place that, in a sense, you refer to my presentation being Pan-Africanist, and I wouldn't necessarily, even though the content is extremely Pan-Africanist, because there is a very real sense of me trying to address that very question. I sense sometimes in referring to politics and referring to where we can commune within politics, sometimes a very rigid sensibility. And that's why I always return to the question of friendship, and I always return to the question of the relationship between people. Sometimes within, what I didn't talk about is there's several different schools or categories within African feminism itself. And, whether it's womanism or kind of post-activism or several different kind of sort of methodologies and understandings. And I feel that when thinking about artists necessarily who have been affected by their proximity to these debates, for me the concern is really about conversations and relationships and how people have taken on ideas interpersonally or interregionally. I'm not necessarily concerned with trying to define for people who they are and what they are and who they describe. I'm interested in what people want them to be. Of course, it sounds like I'm talking about identity, which I guess I am, but at the same time, I'm not, because I'm not trying to say that there is an identity out there that I want people to have. I'm trying to just say that, when people feel an affinity for a certain sort of political discussion and come together and commune around it, I want to know why and how. And how is that manifested within themselves and their work? That's what I'm interested in, not in the nature in which politics polarizes.
I guess some questions asked me. But first, let me say, I not only echoing what Teju has to say, I actually personally experienced it, which really is not only surprising. We went together to her music teacher in Bombay. She was able to sing across what? 4 centuries, all right? You know what I mean? The music produced different centuries, and she would be able to tell this is from this era, this is from this era, at the same time talking to you intellectually and politically. I haven't seen that for my Chinese, right? You have Chinese opera, da-da-da-da. But this is really, she has this tutorial practice, so she's actually a vocalist. Yes, is the right term? I don't know how you say. With the classical Indian, I don't know which section of India, right? I mean, so you see what, and we lost it. Lost the sense of able to even periodize, you know, the live music, but it exists, right? So in that sense, in that context, let me get back to some of this issue with conservatism, whether this is conservative or progressive. This is a problem with the artwork. Presumably, everyone is progressive, right? Please raise your hand. You think I'm not. Please raise your hand. This is what I mean. You speak a hegemonic language. My friend Muto Ichio, the activist intellectual, said, the conservative have the right to exist. I actually love Donald Trump. He really represents a section of white America suppressed by the human rights, right? Becomes suppressed, I think, is the Obama syndrome. Rebounds. Without Obama, there would be no Donald Trump. That's my simple reading, right? So in that sense, I mean, I don't think conservative or progressive is the issue. It's intellectual, critical analysis. I mean, you can't project your ideology onto analysis. Then you don't have to analyze. That's why I tried to say yesterday, we are judges. We say this is wrong. Donald Trump is wrong. But how do you analyze Donald Trump historically and able to explain it? Without explanation, there is no intervention. This is the ABC, right? So in that sense, what I mean by there is a problem with the mode of knowledge. So in that sense, so what? Number one. Number two, how do you know it's conservative or not? Number three, don't forget temple, mosques, and churches are public institutions. They are already, I never said I want to bring temple to the art world. I'm suggesting if we look at temple as the model of the art institution, what would happen? Clear, you see my point, right? I mean, but this is the situation. Once you set this, things immediately become normative question, which I don't give a damn in some way, because our duty is to be able to explain. And because you explain this and you think, what is the way out? Then you have to propose, right? So I'm suggesting it is the worldview embodied by the temple rather than it's a superficial thing in some way, because in religion, in Buddhism, everything is hot, right? So it's our xiang, it's the form. Buddha, or all this form, but it can be anywhere, right? I don't want to go on with the reincarnation. I'm seriously studying reincarnation as an analytical tool, but it's historical, right? Without that, we're not able to account for strange phenomena or what have you. So in that sense, we need to go beyond, right? And I suggested our Indonesian friend occupying the president's office are the archetype for moving beyond right and left. I'm sorry, the right and left has not been our category. You're able to operate on the ground in the third world, you're already beyond left and right. You see my point, right? Because history still lingers. Right and left as a category imposed upon us, our self-colonizing, right? And we need to problematize that. I said I'm remaining a flexible Marxist, right? In that sense, I'm committed to a lot of the simple thing already suggested by the popular faith. 众生皆平等, right? 万事万物皆平等. This is everyone is equal. Human, animal, stones are equal. So in that sense, I think it's much more radical than Marxism, right? It's not human-centric. Marxism was a reaction against capitalism. But let me put this and I'll shut up, all right? Capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, what have you, it's a set of proposition, a set of regulation, want to be implemented, but never properly done. Well, you're not able to, unless once you touch the ground, 接地气, you won't be able to. That's why in my presentation, I didn't have time, I summarized. Low salary, low cost of living, high quality are the main expression of the third world. Popular life. Even Hong Kong. Beijing, they say, Beijing expensive, haircut, 6 RMB. And I can go on, the shoes. I did this once. I bought in Cairo, $5 US, because overproduction and so on. So I don't think, stop using the category without qualification, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, what have you, as if they are the totality. Sorry, they're not. Foreigner is a provocation, right? I am also a foreigner in the sense that we need to return to our past rather than denounce them. I guess that's all I'm saying. We are by definition hybrid. As animal, if you want to talk about reincarnation and so on, right? And so on. Sorry, I interrupt you. You should go on speaking.
I just want to say that Trump as well, like the transforming into the sense, Trump like reads back home to Americans,
No, these are convenient categories. I don't think the category American exists or Canadian or what's that. Let me say last word. I've been saying Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and European do not exist. Only one century. Correct? I said family gentry are much more strong identity than national identity. Disciplinary identity are much more important than national identity. Give you a job.
Anyone want to follow up on that? Yeah, so maybe we'll take one last question.
Well, I don't know much of a question, but I just wanted to, I don't know, like the polemic for the sake of polemic is a bit useless, and I just hear too much about trying to create this polemics and in relation to what was brought up of the temple and the structure of the temple. Yes, I must agree with one of the questions that was said at the beginning of like there has to be a criticality towards the institution of the church or the institution of religion that does have that does come with ideology, and I just feel that we cannot just essentialize everything. And what I enjoyed about a lot of the presentations was the specificity that they were speaking from. Mm-hmm. And she ended up speaking through Buddhism, through a metaphor, without falling into the essentialism of bringing the institution of the church or the clergy. And I think it's even dangerous, even nowadays, when Buddhism in many parts of Asia is actually the main radical source of fascism in the region. So it is dangerous to have this essentialism over what is the roots of culture. And again, it's also unfair for many of the people who are in the audience or on stage to just, again, be polemic and say, oh, why do you read Foucault or post-structuralist French literature if that's imperialist? No. Actually, it is thanks to Foucault that we are questioning those same structures that have acted upon us. And if that wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't be questioning those structures. I mean, those, it's not about putting in the pedestal all these figures, but they are useful, as Buddhism can be useful, as manga subcultures are useful. They're all part of a banquet that we are working with, and just think it's basically not useful to be so polemic just for the sake of the polemics. Sorry, and just one thing about language. Yeah, like, let's also be very specific. When, I mean, for many Tibetans, Mandarin is colonial. It's a colonial language. So there are many other languages that we think are secondary languages that act colonially in many parts of the world. So in some cases, actually, yes, English does work for somehow another avenue to speak out or voice out or create other communities outside of those structures of power. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry to speak again. I just wanted to. I just wanted to respond as well. I don't think that the temple it's supposed to be a metaphor for a holistic center of culture, a center of community life, if I interpret what you were bringing up the temple for. It's not the institution of religion. It's not necessarily, like, I think in the indigenous context that I belong to, that I am part of, we never left the temple, the equivalent. So I think it's for peoples who've gone through other processes and are trying to find a center. Like the white cube comes from the church crypt, comes from the church space. Like it's still a temple of some kind, but I think your critique and why you brought up the temple, as far as I understood it or interpret it, is that it's a non-hierarchical space in the terms of how so much of contemporary art is continuous processes of alienation, so that so many people in the street don't necessarily have an engagement. Maybe we just need to be more honest about who our audiences are. Thank you.
I'll sort of let the sort of who I think your question is directed at respond, but I just want to respond to this sort of idea of audience and why I think it's necessarily, and my thoughts on it. Audiences, I think, are sort of fundamental to some people who theorize that curating and curatorial practice is entirely about audiences. But the question of publics is much more interesting. Because when you're thinking about audiences, anybody could be an audience. We assume within the teaching of curating and in the understanding of curating that you can curate for everyone, right? You just need to sort of set up an audience anywhere. However, the question of publics is a very different question, and what you pointed out earlier about, look at this very room and what is public in relation to who is in this room is a much more interesting and nuanced and subtle question. I think some people also ask the term, who are you curating for? Which is in relation to your sort of also question about indigeneity and the audience and so on. This is also a very, very it's still that assumption that art is, for everyone and art speaks to everything and therefore, no, I don't believe in that. I think art is very constrained in the publics and the public dimensions. I'm speaking as somebody for whom native education, indigenous education, could have severely limited my being involved in the art world. And I'm speaking as somebody who has overcome those limitations in order to participate. So it's not a joking issue when we're talking about how art really either sort of belongs to specific kinds of structures or audience or publics. And so, the question of audience is, that's where I am on that. Also, the question of language, I think it's a very, very interesting question for East Africans and other sort of people who follow discourses along the lines of language as a form of decolonization. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan author, wrote a book called Decolonizing the Mind, in which he's referring explicitly to using language. However, it was a proposition. And propositions, as we know, are hard to implement. So, I mean, when you're talking about using language in order to decolonize or define your engagement with the world, how brave are you in actually implementing it? And who has implemented it?
But it's now being implemented in Ukraine, right? I mean, now there are like laws, they really push it really hard, and then it creates like exclusion actually. So I mean, it excludes certain like parts of people because like, I mean, because like the way the nation and the government envisions or imagines a nation is like really based very strongly on these language ideas, and so they promote, language, like pushing it. And I mean, like my point is that in certain parts of Eastern Europe, it's actually the case,
You mean in terms of that language has been reinstated as a policy to
Yes.
to reinstate the sovereignty of the state, or?
Yes, in a way. I mean, because like for quite a long period of time, like during the Soviet Union, I mean, like Ukrainian language was marginalized, and now, especially like after like Maidan revolution, this sort of policy of reestablishing like hegemony of Ukrainian language are now being kind of raised again, and so the states basically is now starting to like is basing its sort of ideology and like political idea like of nation as being a nation that is defined by language basically, and so all other languages that are there, including like Russian, but then there are also other languages of different groups like Romanians and Hungarians and then Crimean Tatars. They are like being, I don't know, they're being considered as like just languages of minorities that kind of can exist. It's not like there is a genocide, but but then still like they're being marginalized, and especially in relation to Russia, because it's quite a tricky situation, because they can justify this by saying that before that we were kind of Ukrainian language was marginalized, and now we have the rights, to in a way impose on the people who are now speaking Russian, to restore this sort of like historical, how to say it right, I just don't forget. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know the right word.
yeah, I mean, I'll say exactly sort of the same sort of thing that I, in a way, was sort of trying to reinstate before. The notion of public is extremely important in the sense. So this is a country that's sort of trying to radically reorganize and reposition what it understands to be the public and setting rules about that. Therefore, the language, the relationship to Ukrainian as a cannot be the same because it's being politicized and it's sort of like reinstituted in a certain kind of way. So you can't, I mean, in that situation, I can't avoid sort of like the idea of the nation state and how the nation state is sort of promoting its own image of itself by making people speak a certain language back to itself so it can say, yes, we're Ukrainian. You know, that's not precisely, I don't know if that's, I don't think that's what Ngugi wa Thiong'o was necessarily thinking about. Of course, the ideas around nationalism that also relate to decolonization, but I think he was really talking about a shift in the mind, a shift in how we position how we rethink through the language, not the imposition that language can sort of make and therefore.
Ngugi made a statement on decolonizing mind, indicating he will no longer write in English. And he failed. Okay? But that's not the point. The point is the language issue. This is our friend Mahmoud Mamdani suggested, right? Is your compatriot. And he said, identity is the end result of state formation. Language get part of the formation, right? So in other words, none of the category, language become a category for ethnicity, or nationality, but all of which have been invented by anthropologists, with the request from the colonial state, right? You know what I mean? So in other words, all identity need to be put in quotation mark. All language, no boundary, used to be no boundary. Tribe, I thought, tribe was the African notion. No, you talk to Arabic, they say you've been there for 5,000 years, and ripped off by the anthropologists, imposed on Africa. In Taiwan, tribe changes in post-war era from 9 to 15, this year 16. You know what I mean? It's a result of state formation. So I think all the issues are assumption of the nation state. Nation state is a chain of effect with citizenship and all that crap, right? So once we liberate ourselves from the assumption, we'll be able to see what the hell is going on. And we'll not take language difference seriously. Then we get sucked into it. I think you understand, right? So in that sense, the gentleman sitting back there, ideological. Number one, what is not ideological? This is a cultural study ABC, all right? Number two, I think the problem is I don't understand you, you don't understand me, in the sense we don't know our background. This has always been the problem with conversation, right? When I said Foucault, my dissertation is about Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, and Baudrillard. People still doing that. That was 30 years ago. I have huge respect for these people. But at the same time, I'm saying, given the condition colonial, I have a friend called Alan Brossard, teaching in our institution, Paris 8, retired then, and he said, I have nothing to do with colonialism. But you say, this is Stewart Hall. The sugar is in the bottom of your coffee. Paris subway are subsidized, supported by the colonial tax. That's the dimension I'm talking about. I'm not throwing away any of these. I mean, Foucault is an extremely important thinker, but none of the important, critical issues have been articulated by these important figures. You get my point. So I've never said don't read Foucault, all right? You don't get it? Simply, if you live in Hong Kong, yes, your subway is supported by the colonial tax. You are using it, and you said I have nothing to do with it. I think that's a popular, simple, conviction. If 13 colonial state, tax from African state, we have to be responsible as citizens of that country. You know what I mean? So it's not like I'm telling you shouldn't read Foucault. You simply twist my question around, right? So that's the point I'm making.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd like to intervene in this conversation. Also, like a little bit with what, with Leuli's response to Inti, because I think this is something that, runs through a little bit the conference where, I mean, Leuli said that, I think speaking on behalf of many indigenous people that they've never left the temple, and that's very true. And that's definitely the case for many colonized people. But it's not the case for all of them. And it's also definitely not the case for China. And I think it's important to say that, in China we had two major revolutions that were about, destroying the temple. It was the first modernist revolution. There was the Cultural Revolution. And these were homegrown revolutions that were also anti-colonial in nature. And whatever one's position is around them, I think it's important to say that there is an intellectual and political tradition within China that is also that is emancipatory, and which is about, building a form of Chinese modernity that is outside of the temple. And this also leads me to the idea that I think, speaking from the perspective of China and of Chinese culture, it's important to situate oneself in a different position than most colonized people. When you are now speaking from the perspective of, one of the great empires that is now acting imperially in the world, and also within itself, where this, the national rejuvenation that, our president, proudly mentioned today, is, is achieved. I mean, we've been told. So this is probably the true now. Then we cannot use the same positions, we cannot use the same principles, and we cannot speak from the same position as most people who were colonized. And yeah, it's very difficult to justify that at the end.
This is not directly following up on everyone's, but I wanted to use a few specific anecdotes and stories to reflect upon, public audience and language even. Speaking from the perspective of an art historian who has worked in a museum like the Met, I need to say that, temples play a prominent role in our discipline. I was digging in a temple, and then the Temple of Dendor was placed right inside of the museum. There are all kinds of older contexts of worship and social organization that are now carefully and thoughtfully positioned in museums to be studied and then to be revisited. And there's always this criticism that museums are where artworks go to die, but then that's a position that I think forgets that sometimes the visitors have agency beyond our imagination. For instance, in the Asian art galleries where we have some early Chinese Buddhist sculptures from the 5th to the 8th century, and these are huge bodhisattvas, but they're placed next to each other. That's definitely not temple placement, but then sometimes you see visitors come in and they bow in front of one of these sculptures, and in that one single gesture, they're restoring the ritual function or cultural function that these objects do have. And museums, whatever they do, whatever kind of institutionalization, cannot take that away from an audience or a visitor who choose to do that, and always found that quite beautiful. And when museums like the Met started to think about using digital technology to help, using apps to help visitors navigate the gallery, a lot of art historians came out against it, saying that if you give people the capacity and the screens to look at, they're not going to look at the artwork. But after doing some research, people realized that having the information at hand and having a screen next to the artworks actually enable the audience to look longer, because they now have this kind of prosthetic device that empowers them to approach and look much more closely than they otherwise would. And so that's, two anecdotes related to that. And then at the same time, just going back to the whole football, soccer reference I was making, I had a very unforgettable experience in the San Siro Stadium in Milan after going to the Venice Biennial in 2015. And I caught a game, but because I arrived late, I ended up on the hardcore fan stage. Where they were chanting the whole time. They were all male and they were peeing at the corners, and they are catcalling. I felt like I was in a different world, but I was in Milan, I was in Italy, and I had just come back from the Venice Biennial where people are talking about all of these deep, hard questions of humanitarian crises, and then you find yourself among a real kind of real-life public that this discourse probably will never reach. But then at the same time, you know that there are languages that can reach them. I sought out one of the fan fiction writers because I loved her writing so much. She's so versatile. She's a really good writer. But the way she perceived my passion was, she was bewildered, but she was also like, what do you want? And so that position stuck with me, and I think knowing that there are that kind of public out there, and that requires very active engagement rather than I'm opening my institution, just come in. That's a very self-selective kind of audience. There are other kinds of audience out there, and I think we needed to speak their language. And I'm speaking about language not as, English, Chinese, but I'm speaking about a very specific kind of forms of communication. Is like, we might not know each other well, but if you like Beyonce, we're talking. So that's the kind of language I'm speaking about sometimes that can bypass the rigid linguistic barriers.
Okay, so, maybe Beyonce is the time is the signal that it's time to end. But thank you all so much for your wonderful presentations, and thank you to the audience for being here with us.